In part 2 of this lecture on the motivations for European expansionism and exploration, we'll be examining the influence of religion, religious reasons for exploration, and in particular, the impact of one specific event, the Protestant Reformation. And then we'll conclude by taking a look at what this all leads to, which is political changes throughout the European world and the growth of nation-states. A religious motivation for European expansionists was something known as proselytizing zeal. And what this means is the idea that Europeans should spread their version of Christianity throughout the world. This could be for a variety of purposes. One could be for freeing the Holy Land from the influence of the Muslims. Some hope to find Christian allies in Asia that could provide new funds for new crusades, or simply the idea of spreading your beliefs throughout the world. Another religious motivation was religious institutional conflicts, and in particular the impact of an event known as the Protestant Reformation. To understand the impact of this event, we have to go back to the 15th century in Europe. In the 1400s, Roman Catholicism was entrenched in government and culture. Roman Catholicism was the dominant political and social philosophy and essentially the operating manual for Europe. But Roman Catholicism had critics. Critics said the church had resorted to cults and superstition, veneration of relics and indulgences to battle sin. Indulgences were paying a fee to the church in order to wash away sin. The Catholic Church was hit with scandal after scandal. Friends and relatives of popes were invited to fill high posts in the church. Some wealthy bought positions as cardinals in the Catholic Church. It actually got a name, it was so common. It was called selling the red hat. And it raised a great deal of money. The famous Sistine Chapel at the Vatican was paid for by selling the red hat. Other critics said the clergy too frequently never preached or attended to the faithful, and religious teaching remained outdated and intolerant of new ideas. Tradition and conformity reigned, and there were those that said it was time for a change. Those who called for a change were protesters, or Protestants. The Protestant Reformation began in Germany in 1517 under the leadership of a Roman Catholic priest named Martin Luther. Luther believed that many practices of the Roman Catholic Church were contrary to the teachings of the Bible. In particular, he believed and taught that salvation was by faith alone, rather than by Catholicism's elaborate system of sacraments. Luther denied the primacy of the Pope. He said that the only source of faith is Scripture, not the Pope. He said that only baptism and the Eucharist were the only worthy sacraments. He said that cults should be abolished, particularly those that venerated so-called sacred relics. Luther said that priests need not be celibate. And perhaps most importantly, Luther argued that the Bible should be printed not just in Latin, but in the language of the local community. For instance, in his country it would be German, or it could be English, or French, or Spanish. For the purposes of United States history, the impact of the Protestant Reformation in England becomes paramount. King Henry VIII, a Roman Catholic, broke with Rome in order to divorce his first wife, marry a second, and he hoped to obtain a male heir to secure his dynasty's succession. However, divorce was forbidden in Roman Catholicism. Henry simply resolved this by establishing his own church, the Church of England, which was called the Anglican Church in America, and Henry made himself the head of the church and then granted himself a divorce. Aside from breaking with the Pope, who had refused Henry's request for a divorce, the king wanted to retain most of the trappings of Catholicism, but the Reformation could not be contained. Henry's son and successor, Edward VI, who was king from 1547 to 1553, embraced a more complete Protestantism, but died after only 6 years on the throne. Here you can see the Tudor dynastic succession. There's Henry VIII, who was Catholic, then Protestant, who was replaced by his son, Edward VI. Edward VI was Henry's oldest surviving son. In those days, the eldest son always became the monarch. It did not matter if he had an older sister. That law has been changed, and today it's the eldest child, whether male or female, who becomes the heir to the throne. Edward VI was Henry's oldest surviving son. He became king at the age of 9, but he died of a lung disease, probably tuberculosis. He was replaced through palace intrigue for a very short time by a queen who was called Lady Jane Grey. And if you look at this graphic here, you will see that she was only queen for 9 days, from July 10th to July 19th in 1553. She was a Protestant, and she was in place because of palace maneuvering. She was named Edward VI's heir by Edward himself just before he died. After serving only 9 days, Lady Jane Grey was deposed, and then she was executed. She was probably 16 or 17 years old. Lady Jane Grey was then replaced by Mary I, Queen Mary. She was a Catholic. She was Henry's oldest daughter. She was queen for 5 years when she died of cancer complicated by influenza. However, during the time she was queen, Mary endeavored to reconvert England to Catholicism through violent means. At one point, she burnt 283 Protestants alive at the stake. Many English Protestants fled to Geneva, Switzerland, where they were influenced by John Calvin. After Mary died, she was replaced by Elizabeth, who was Henry VIII's second daughter. Elizabeth I reigned for 45 years and is arguably the most famous queen of England. She famously never married and said that she was married to England. She became queen at 25 and continued well into her 60s, which is quite old for the time period. Elizabeth I became known as the Virgin Queen, an icon similar to veneration of the Virgin Mary among Catholics. She was a Protestant, and so England, over the decades, switched between Protestantism and Catholicism, which led to almost constant social and political turmoil. Because of this turmoil, Elizabeth established an extraordinary spy network within England to spy upon those who threatened her or her Protestant rule. In 1570, the Pope declared Elizabeth I a heretic. Essentially, this was a wanted dead or alive notice. During her reign, there were 14 assassination plots against Elizabeth. In this famous painting, called the Eyes and Ears painting, you can see on Elizabeth's dress the symbol of her spy network. There were people watching everywhere. Eyes and ears were on everyone. Some English Protestants simply fled the turmoil in England and went to Switzerland, where they were influenced by the theologian John Calvin. Some became what were called radical separatists, who simply wanted to leave England and establish their own religious community far away from any secular influence. In our history, the radical separatists are known as the Pilgrims. Those who wanted to purify not only Catholicism but also the Church of England came to be known as Puritans. And the English Puritans followed Calvinistic doctrine. John Calvin taught something called double predestination. That's the idea that God predestines for some that they'll be saved, and for others that they'll be damned and sent to hell. It's called double predestination because 2 directions are involved. One is up for heaven, the other is down for hell. The Puritans generally refined this to a dualistic view. One was called collective predestination, in which the Puritans were chosen as what they called the elect, to provide an example or to provide secular leadership when Jesus returned to earth. Other Puritans believed in something called individual predestination, in which an individual would be subject to predestination, either going to hell or to heaven. John Calvin, in his philosophy, believed that God was an absolute sovereign, that humans by nature are unable to exercise free will and must give their heart and soul to religious values. When it came to predestination, Calvin also taught that humans cannot win salvation by good works alone or profitably speculate about God's method of predestination. It was simply a mystery. However, Calvin also said that humans should constantly examine their souls and consider their helplessness and hopelessness before God. Calvinism had an enormous influence on British Protestantism and through it, early American thought. All the religious turmoil in England allowed the British American colonies in North America to develop with a degree of independence that was unheard of for colonial people throughout the world at the time. This played a major role in the development of the spirit of independence and a revolutionary spirit in colonial America. All of these religious reasons, all of these religious motivations ended up with political changes in Europe. There started to be the growth of nation states. In order to finance religious crusades or religious explorations, Small principalities and dukedoms and kingdoms consolidated into larger units which came to be known as nation-states. And they were in competition with each other economically, socially, politically, and religiously. In the history of the United States, 5 European nations come to dominate the impact upon the New World. Those 5 countries are Portugal, Holland, the Netherlands, Spain, France, and England. And in particular, in the history of the United States, 3 nations from Europe, 3 nation-states from Europe, become the dominant ones: Spain, France, and England. They were in conflict for decades, centuries, for control of the treasure house and political power that was provided for by North America.